For me, what the artist does is to explore consciousness, basically. It's this role of art as being an exploration of consciousness, a self-enhancing medium, so that you not only enhance your own understanding, but you pass it on. You see this with calligraphy, for instance, where 2,000 years ago, the actual meaning of the words ceased to be what it was all about. What mattered was the dance of the brush and how sophisticated that was and how that movement was all part of the process. You shifted from the art product, i.e. the meaning of the calligraphy, to the art process, which was the self-realization, enhancing one's own character, not just the characters on the brushed onto the paper, but one's own inner character, and then expressing that so that the audience could join the dance, basically. The process didn't stop with the work of art. The process included the audience that indefinitely thereafter with its subjective, constantly changing mind. And that's a very much more sophisticated approach to art. It's the approach we now have in the West since the modern revolution. You can't understand Duchamp's upturned pissoir, or a great deal else that went on in the modern revolution, purely based on the object. I much prefer to look upon any response to creativity, any creative response to experience, as being potentially an art form. That gets around the problem of deciding first whether something is a work of art or not before you grant it aesthetic attention. And it also allows you to avoid the problem of saying someone is an artist and someone isn't, which always strikes me as a bit arbitrary. One of the ideas when I paint is that instead of painting what I see, I prefer to see what I paint. So one is inspired by every trip you've ever taken, every skiing trip where you're up in the mountains, every time you've walked through forests and so forth. It's all in there, and it can be re-expressed. So the studio is, and my home, a chock-a-block with strange stones and strange roots, and the Chinese are very much into those as art forms, and I've always been intrigued. Our gardens in Sussex are chock-a-block with wonderful old trees, and I've spent an enormous amount of time just wandering amongst them and looking, and rarely sketching, mostly just looking. The Chinese ideal tends to be that you walk 1,000 miles and read 1,000 books, and then you go back to the studio and you paint or write or create. Surrounded by Chinese works of art, a library full of books on Chinese works of art. It's what I was brought up with and what I understood better. So when I started to paint, which I started maybe in the 1980s, it was automatically the Chinese aesthetic that I adopted, the Chinese materials, Chinese brushes, Chinese formats, which are very, very sophisticated. because they've been honed for their sophistication in rising beyond the physical art object to the much broader process of civilizing humanity, basically. And I've never been anything else. So when I paint to explore. I paint to discover what is in the painting. I may start with an idea, like I'll paint a mountain, or I'll paint a tree, or it doesn't matter. But most of the time, I don't actually have anything specific in mind. And crucially, whatever happens during the process of painting, I simply follow it. So what starts out as a landscape might end up as a seated figure reading a book. I never know, and that's part of the excitement for me. One of the things I find about creativity is that when you're thinking to paint something, you see things differently. So when you look at trees and rocks, before you had any intention of painting them or writing about them or whatever, you just saw them. You saw the surface, but you didn't see into the surface, beyond the surface. I think the artist sees things differently, and that's a very important part of being an artist. So that when you look at a rock, you recognize and record in your mind how it's laid out, what the surface looks like, and where the light falls, and so forth. And the same with trees. It's a very important part of being an artist, is that ability to see differently, because that's part of what makes your particular vision as an artist, if you like to call it, different from everybody else's. And that's part of what helps you. Seeing a different point of view is frightfully important in terms of the evolution of consciousness, and that can be done visually as well as orally. One of the things I learned about Chinese painting quite early on was that the terminology from the West, from our Western ideas of art theory, are quite inadequate. We tend to look at Chinese paintings, if we don't really understand them very well, and think, well, they can't be. Look how old-fashioned they are. Look how traditional they are. No abstraction, no abstract expressionism, and so forth. The problem is we don't know where to look. Chinese art has actually been abstract for 2,000 years, particularly in the art of calligraphy as opposed to the art of writing meaning. But the abstraction is not on the surface. What happened in China was that they took the 5 languages, subject matter, line, form, colour and texture, and instead of rejecting one, i.e. subject matter, in order to explore another, i.e. abstraction, they simply abstracted the inner languages. So if you look at a series of 17th century Chinese paintings of little men with walking staffs in overpowering mountains, a little hut somewhere and a waterfall, they all look boringly similar until you start looking at the inner languages. And then they become dynamically different. And the abstraction is in the use of the ink, the use of the brush, the dance of the brush is the equivalent of abstract expressionism, just under a somewhat more balletic control, because like ballet, calligraphy has to be learned the hard way. You have to, the old-fashioned way was to first learn Chinese, then learn the various scripts, then practice until you've got them all completely the way they should be written properly. Then you can make a contribution to the calligraphic aesthetic by taking that and breaking the rules. You can't really break the rules without knowing what the rules are. It's like ballet. You can't dance ballet if you haven't gone through the process. And the process itself is character building. So that's part of this business of self-realization of character. When it came to understanding ancient Chinese painting, the concept of three perfections became very obvious to me very early on. It's a Chinese concept of combining painting with poetry, with calligraphy, which by the 8th, 10th century were the three main creative modes with the brush. So they simply started writing poetic inscriptions all over their paintings, and that gives you an extra formal dimension because you're balancing a subject matter with poetic intent, and then with the calligraphy, writing with the brush. Now, by the time I took it up, I'm not particularly good at learning languages, and never found it madly necessary or encouraging. I was still struggling with English. So it occurred to me that what I could do is just write in English, but in a Chinese calligraphic fashion. By that time, I had been agent for many of the leading Chinese artists outside of China, including several calligraphers, including 2 or 3 of the greatest calligraphers of the 20th century. So I'd watched them. I listened to them talking about the nature of calligraphy, and they'd show me how to hold a brush and how to do this and that and how to use the ink. So I was very familiar with all of that, and I saw no reason why I shouldn't just apply it to English. So I did, which turned out to be rather a useful gimmick because, of course, it sets your work apart from anybody else's. And if you want to gain attention, part of the creativity in art is to create the paintings. The other part is to get people to notice them, to get their attention. Because it doesn't matter how wise you are, if you're trying to pass on information verbally and you're not saying anything that intrigues anyone, no one's going to listen. I approach every painting as a forever painting. No time constraints, no particular thing in mind, no object to create. They just take as long as they get taken. And I find that's a very, very useful approach because then you're not looking at your watch or wondering what time the first glass of wine's coming along. It's an adventure, basically. It's like being an explorer. The original explorers, on behalf of humanity, on behalf of consciousness, spread themselves around the globe to discover something new all the time. A dangerous business often, but exciting and very worthwhile when they came back home with new knowledge and new artifacts, whatever. Understanding of different cultures. With painting, you can do all of that without leaving the studio. No snakes, no bad weather, and it's exactly the same process as far as I'm concerned. You delve into the unknown and see what happens. It's a rather, when I say creativity is the governing factor, when you're painting, say, a landscape that turns out to be a snow-covered mountainous landscape, you're actually creating a landscape that no one has ever seen before. And it's a very exciting, very meditational process. I find that time disappears when I'm painting. I literally step off the stage of time. And it comes to the same sort of result as many meditational practices, where you are trying to close down the intellect and just deal directly with reality. So that as a process is, as far as I'm concerned, what my art is all about, why I do it, and why I keep on doing it, and why I find it every bit as exciting every single time I do. I haven't been bored in 40 years. All I have to do is put a piece of paper on the painting table, and away I go.